All right, well, hello and welcome to the 6th webinar of our OPI Indian Education for All Background Knowledge series on sovereignty. My name is Jennifer Statham, and I am an Indian Education for All implementation specialist at OPI. Thanks so much for joining us this evening. Each webinar will be recorded and participants will remain muted with their cameras off so we can focus on the presenter and their content. A link to the recording playlist is now available on our Indian Ed for All webpage at the top of the resources page and on your reminder letters, though you'll only be receiving one more for Thursday night for Donnie Wetzel's presentation. Feel free to use the chat if you have any questions or comments. And of course, you know, I'll do my best to get all of the questions in. And then at the end, we will have time for question and answers. So please make sure to ask your questions, but do ask your questions throughout as well. Your feedback is really valuable. Please make sure to complete those feedback surveys, even if you are not seeking renewal or professional development units. The link will open the last 15 minutes of the webinar. And as a reminder, the link is also on the sign-in sheet, which is open now. So make sure to get in the sign-in sheet as well as put your name in chat. But in case there's any issues with us cutting and pasting the link, just go to the sign-in sheet and the link is there as well. But that won't open till the last 15 minutes and it will remain open through tomorrow only. If you are watching this as a recording, there is a survey link that will be available in both the playlist description as well as in the video description for all of our recorded webinar videos. And now to introduce tonight's guest, Casey Lozar. Casey was born and raised on the Flathead Indian Reservation in Montana and is an enrolled member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Tribes. Casey is vice president at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and the director of the Center for Indian Country Development. In this role, he brings actionable research and policy development to advance Indian country economic self-determination with a focus on access to affordable capital, tribal public finance, and advancing economic infrastructure, which I am sure you will find tonight relates to sovereignty. Casey holds a BA in history from Dartmouth, an MED from Harvard University, and an MBA from the University of Colorado, Denver, and serves on the Montana Board of Regents. Welcome, Casey. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm so delighted that you agreed to present with us.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for the invitation. And Hesquax to Chumniti to wit Skuliat Squast to Chenes Sailor Skose and Kulem Chimkoneku. And so what I just shared in Salish is I am Casey Lozar, but I'm known in our tribal language as Bighorn Boy, and I'm a member of the Confederate Salish and Kootenai Tribes in Flathead. Grew up in Polson. Polson's my hometown, and it's just a pleasure to be able to be in front of all of you today and to be a part of this broader conversation with regards to sovereignty, tribal sovereignty, and in this case, this evening, economic sovereignty of our tribes. So let me, bear with me for a second while I work on sharing my screen, and then we can get going. Jennifer, do you want to give me a thumbs up that you can see my first slide?
We can see your first slide, and if you want to go up to from beginning, then we can see it's full screen.
Okay.
And then if you have any problems navigating, if you go down to the bottom lower left corner, you can see the zoom advance and backwards buttons.
You'll have to bear with me. I do have it from the beginning, but it's on one of my other monitors. Let's see if I can share using
No
this.
worries. This is the fun of presenting online.
Can you see it now?
It's still in the reduced view. There we go. Perfect.
No, that's not advancing.
Do you see the little button? Sometimes you have to hover in that lower left-hand corner There you go. Yep.
We're good to go. Awesome. All right. Well, again, it's a pleasure to be with each and every one of you tonight. I wanted to share a little bit and add to this conversation that's happened for the last 5 sessions in the series, is to sort of lift up and add a little bit of sort of history and maybe a new angle on the conversation around sovereignty. And for me, I wanted to provide just maybe a little background of myself and how I came to this topic and came to this work that I have the honor to be able to do on behalf of Indian country and in partnerships with tribes and tribal associations. I grew up at Flathead, and when my father was he was the head of tribal education for CSKT, and when I was about 4 years old, he left his position with the tribes, and he was an artist, and he wanted to continue to do his art as a way to provide for our family. And he did that in a really interesting way. He ended up borrowing some money from tribal credit and purchased this small little business that was in Big Fork, just off the reservation north of Flathead. And the business was called Total Screen Design. And Total Screen Design is a silk screen and embroidery business that he brought. When he purchased it, he brought it to Polson. And as a part of doing silk screening and embroidery, you have to have art. So this was his opportunity to really follow his passion and use his skill set, but try his hand in entrepreneurism. And that is, how he and how our family got involved in business and got involved in sort of understanding the business's role in the economic health and well-being of tribal communities. So ever since I was probably 5 years old, I was working, doing a wide variety of jobs. It could have been sweeping up the floor at the business, or when I got older, actually starting to print or to deliver some of our products to our customers. And so much of my decision making in my career was really sort of anchored to that experience working for Total Screen Design, both the really good parts of being participating in a family business, and the challenging parts of participating in a family business. And I think that has sort of framed how I think about individual sovereignty, how I think about Indian country economic sovereignty, and really how I think about this idea that we continue in Indian country, we continue to grow and appreciate and expand, and that being self-determination. So our ability to really make choices, individual choices, and tribal choices about how we want to live out our lives and what our economic destinies will be. So it really started with ink all over my hands, and with me misprinting t-shirt after t-shirt after t-shirt, that really drove me into this, my interest, and drove me into this field of economic development. So this afternoon and this evening, I wanted to provide a bit of a history lesson. I think as some of the other speakers in the series did, understanding and anchoring the term sovereignty, it's important to understand where this idea came from and how we practice sovereignty as Indian people, and how that has been impacted in our experience engaging in this experience that is the United States of America. And so I will kind of cover a number of different eras that that are specific to how we think about economic self-determination and how that has changed, and how, as Indian people and as tribes, how we've been able to more closely realize self-determination in the past about 50 years or so. So I'm going to start back in the old days. So I want to go way back to pre-contact times, and maybe dispel a few myths about economic activity among tribes and across tribes in what is now the United States, primarily North America. One of the things that I hear often in my work at the Federal Reserve and at the Center for Indian Country Development, and I hear it outside of my role at the Fed, and that is everything that was done, among tribes was communal, and every decision was communal, every asset was communal, and in many ways that is factual. But when you start to sort of peel the onion and look back at our unique histories, you'll find that there is certainly a different perspective that our ancestors experienced as you think about trade, as you think about leveraging land, the natural resources, and the role of individuals and family groups as they built their own economies. So I wanted to just pause, pause and go back and talk a little bit about our historic tribal economies. And one of my good friends, Bob Miller, has recently written a book called Reservation Capitalism, which I think he does an incredible job of particularly distilling the private sector elements of both historic and modern tribal economies. So I will be pulling some of the stories that he and I have shared, as well as some of the things that he's shared in this book, Reservation Capitalism. And I should note, I know him well, that it's important to see in this title of this book that capitalism has quotes on it. So this type of capitalism that we talk about and that's talked about in the newspaper today is probably a slightly different version of the capitalism that existed several hundred years ago. So I want to start with private property rights. And I think this is important as a feature of self-determination. When you think about the individual property rights, certainly land generally was inhabited and leveraged by larger tribal groups, by tribes, by extensive bands that sort of participated in the deployment of those resources in ways that fed our people, in ways that allowed for sort of sharing of very unique goods that were produced in different parts of the United States or different parts of North America. And as it relates to land, specifically, and I'm thinking of more here in the perspective of individuals or family groups, there was definitely title, not written title, but title, and an understanding that there were individual property rights that existed. And a couple of the examples that I think best underscore this idea is some of the fishing sites, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, where individuals or families produced these platforms that were in very productive parts of the rivers in the Pacific Northwest, particularly the Columbia River. And they built these platforms where they could spear or they could net large quantities in efficient ways of the different fish in those rivers. And it was known across families and individuals, across bands, and across different tribes, that those platforms were specifically owned, and those individuals had rights, and they could share those rights with others, the access to that platform in this case. But inherently it was their platform, even down to specific rocks on rivers that were well accustomed for efficient fishing. Even some of those rocks were claimed, and it was understood that there were rights specific, use rights specific to that very small parcel of a rock. And some other examples of private property rights in our historic economies is certain berry patches. There were families and individuals that had rights to certain berry patches, and those were it was certainly known by folks who came through, other tribes or families that came through, that they needed to seek approval for accessing those patches. The sort of list goes on. I mean, there were certain areas in the plains where families had rights to certain herds of wild game, of big game. But that is not a story that's often told. It's often sort of the general assumption that all of that land was communal. But property rights played an incredibly important role, particularly around land ownership. There were other private property rights that existed that you will see continue to exist today, and that was other rights that were not land. So think about certain images. There were certain images on lodges that had exclusive rights to either individuals or families, and that was well understood. That sort of ownership of intellectual property was very well understood by folks in community. Certain songs or certain types of dances were held close by individuals. Regalia, medicine, sort of the list goes on. So there were these rights that existed that was fully understood in this complicated context of various tribes, bands interacting, integrating with each other. And similarly, as you could imagine, with certain property rights and certain leadership titles in our traditional communities, wealth accumulation was a significant aspect of property rights. And there were both chiefs and more entrepreneurial folks who were able to raise assets, considerable assets, thinking about like sizes of horse herds and revenues that came in a variety of different currencies for the trade that came through, that production of berries and fish and game and fur and all of those things. And where you see this sort of underscored or highlighted is, the wealth accumulation in particular was the potlatches that existed in the Pacific Northwest, where traditionally those that had significant amount of wealth, it was the biggest honor to be able to give away their assets to those in need, and those assets came directly in many ways from some of the private property rights that they enjoyed. So this idea, right, that everything was just communal across our tribal communities is inaccurate. And I think that plays an important role in thinking, as we get further in this presentation, thinking about how we as individual Indian people and how we as tribes develop our tribal economies and advance and really shore up our ability to practice economic self-determination. Across tribes, certainly economic development, that is probably more of a modern term, was a part of our everyday lives. So Think about land acquisitions that happen either through trade between tribes, through sort of conflict, tribes looking at trying to get access to the resources to be able to provide for their growing populations. So land is always an important feature when you think about economy. That's the case in Indian country, in tribal communities, and outside of. Today, we talk a lot about infrastructure, economic infrastructure. You go back to our historic tribal economies. There were complicated irrigation systems for those communities that did a lot of farming. There's lots of instances of small families getting 3-ish acre lots and developing these irrigation systems that not only support their ability to farm and to grow, but were integrated with other families' irrigation systems. And this is that infrastructure that allowed folks to grow things, share, trade, and that was a typical aspect of our historic economies. Trading is another a fascinating aspect of tribal economies. There were certain tribes, and it's still the case again today, but there are certain tribes that had value-added manufacturing. Again, that's a modern term, but you apply it to our histories. There are tribes that would take things like, in the Southwest, take turquoise and adapt and add value to that turquoise in the form of jewelry or currency. And then that was used as a trading good with both within tribes and with other tribes. There are these complex markets or rendezvous, as some have been referred to, where there was an understanding that at a certain time of every year, tribes within a certain region would come to market, and they would come with the goods that they've produced themselves, or the goods that they've been able to pull from our environment. And this was certainly a place where, it's very similar to, every year I attend a national conference called RES, and it's the Reservation Economic Summit, where tribes all across the country come and showcase the goods and services they're providing, and it gives them an opportunity to identify other businesses that they want to work with, that they want to trade with, et cetera. So these markets that exist now have existed for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years. And lastly, I wanted to share a little bit about the currencies. Currencies, an incredibly important aspect of stable economies. Now we use the dollar here in the United States. Tribes had a very comprehensive system of different currencies in different regions, and Northeast, generally speaking, wampum was produced by a couple of tribes that essentially assigned some value to those shells. Other Dentalia shells were used particularly in the West or Pacific Northwest, turquoise in the South. Mississippi River Valley used buckskin as a currency for selling goods and services, and that's how, interesting fact, that's how we have come in the United States, have come to use the term buck. A buck is a dollar, and a buck is originated back to tribes in the Mississippi Valley using deerskin, buckskin as currency. So what I really want you to sort of reflect on is that the core elements of our tribal economies have existed for a long time in a very complex and complicated way. It's not that tribes are really beginning to understand economic sovereignty and what that means, and economic motivations. We've always had this ingrained in our cultures and our ways of being, or our ways that we live out our life in partnership with others. As you can imagine, and I'm going to be jumping around a little bit historically here, but as you can imagine, we experienced at Contact and after Contact, we've experienced a lot of direct impacts or assaults on what I shared in the previous slide. There have been over the last couple of hundred years a significant number of federal Indian policies, some state policies that have impacted our ability to truly practice economic sovereignty and economic self-determination. And a couple quotes that I cherry picked from one of Bob's book. The first one being, the political ends of Indian policies inevitably serve the interest of non-Indian groups. And I think that those of you who understand federal Indian policy and the experience our tribes have had over the past 200-300 years, that's not jaw-dropping, not a jaw-dropping quote. We've come to understand that federal Indian policy was not necessarily designed to support our sovereignty or extend our sovereignty. Rather, it was the latter. The second quote, colonials like to regard the Indians as a member of a nomadic hunting race with no fixed habitation as an excuse for taking Indian land. This is an important concept. Again, there's so many terrible myths or misconceptions as it relates to tribes and to tribal people. And I think this is one of the ones that was strategically embedded in the American conscience, particularly in the 1700s and 1800s, that we were just people that had no connection to any specific land. We were just roaming. We were roaming the plains or roaming the mountains. And it was all, in many ways, obviously it's not true. Our communities had these close and rich connection and a history of working with the land in certain areas, very specific areas of the land for our to retain our existence and to flourish as we did before Contact. And this idea of us being a nomadic group was really by design, as a way to say, look, tribes, they don't have any sort of connection to land. They don't have any sort of title to land. Therefore, we're in a position to be able to take land. And you can imagine, as I shared earlier, land has such a critically important role in economies. And through these federal Indian policies that were designed to strip our land, certainly we were negatively impacted in the 1800s and 1900s, and we're still fighting to get back where we were nearly a couple hundred years ago. And one of the examples that I wanted to share of this is a piece of research, a fascinating piece of research that was done through my organization, the Federal Reserve, the Center for Indian Country Development. And we had an economic researcher who wanted to understand the impacts of the slaughter of the bison on tribal economies, both during the time of the slaughter of the bison, but also its impact, its implications for tribal people now. And she did a fascinating project where she collected, data on certainly bison herd population, the deterioration of the bison herd, the specific tribes that were reliant on those bison, down to data that was identified by individual of the size of those individuals and how the removal of the bison impacted even just literally the height and the weight of Indian people, and how it was able to strip not only bison as a source for food, but also a source for trade. And through this research, she and Rob and Maggie were able to quantitatively showcase how the federal government's policy around bison and removing bison-reliant tribes to reservations had an economic impact and also had an impact on the health of our tribal communities. So these policies were really disastrous. And I think we're all aware of that, generally speaking. But the impacts were felt even more as we moved from the 1800s, into the 1900s. And I am jumping, several, decades here to the Indian Reauthorization Act of 1934. But I think when you think about, the era of bison deterioration and Indian Reauthorization Act, certainly Allotment Act was associated with that. So it was a continual stripping of our ability to have control over our land. And if we don't have control over our land, it was very difficult for us to be able to provide economically for our communities. So I share here the Indian Reauthorization Act of 1934, and this was really a byproduct of about 15 years of analysis of the economic and health conditions of Indian people and of tribes in the 1920s and early 1930s. And as we lost our land, we lost our ability to thrive economically. And for the first time in the United States, the federal government history, federal Indian policy had attempted, I should say, to have a positive impact on improving the health and livelihood of tribes and Indian people. And one of the elements of this act, the act covered a whole lot of different things. It gave tribes the opportunity to elect a what they called then a modern governance structure. Many tribes chose to participate within a new Indian an IRA government, and some tribes chose not to. But embedded, and you kind of have to pull it out of this piece of legislation, is of this line that it refers to economic development. And I think it maybe have been one of the first pieces in federal Indian legislation that called out specifically the promotion of economic development in Indian country. So I see this as a slight turn in the right direction, maybe a pivot from past federal Indian practices. Granted, the IRA still had disastrous impacts for our communities. But what this Section 10 is referring to is that for the first time, the federal government is acknowledging tribes' ability to have their own chartered corporations, which is their own commercial operations. And it goes a step further where federal government, knowing the sort of the economic conditions of Indian people at that time, the access to capital to get these corporations started was particularly important. And so they added this to this piece of legislation that tribes probably for the first time ever had the ability to access some capital to start practicing in a limited perspective, economic self-determination, first time in the previous couple hundred years or so. So this IRA Act of 1934 was an important juncture for our tribal communities and for tribal economies. And this act really paves the way to some of the opportunities that came to Indian country and to economic sovereignty towards the latter part of the 1900s. And again, I'll jump another disastrous era in federal Indian policy, but I should acknowledge it. You know, between allotment and this IRA Act of 1934, the United States had a formal policy called Indian termination and relocation. And, you know, the federal government literally terminated its trust relationships and treaty obligations to a handful of tribes to test out the ability for the federal government to go against treaties and have that be sort of memorialized in legislation and in policy, knowing that Congress has, you know, the plenary power over tribal people, which was embedded in the United States Constitution. So termination and relocation had some significant, continue to carry on these significant challenges that we had for economic development. But it was in, you know, a lot of the work of tribal leaders, National Congress of American Indian, which is kind of the largest representative association of tribes across the country, which started in, I think, 1952. They began to ask for change. They began to ask for these federal Indian policies are not improving our economic well-being, are not improving our economic conditions in our communities, and we demand change. And you know, this was kind of the era where some higher education leaders in Indian country began to start chartering their own tribal colleges. This is when the AIM movement really picked up, and a lot of the social unrest that in the late 60s sort of helped inform a brand new era, a brand new federal Indian policy that has had a dramatic impact on tribes' ability to truly practice economic sovereignty. And this idea of self-determination, tribal self-determination, was really first originated from the federal government side in a speech that President Nixon gave in the early 1970s. I think it was 1970, August of 1970, where, you know, I pulled out a couple of quotes from his speech. The first is important, is just the acknowledgement that what we've done, it has not improved the lives of Indian people, and that and the quote is, "The first Americans, the Indians, are the most deprived and most isolated minority group in our nation. On virtually every scale of measurement, employment, income, education, health, the condition of Indian people ranks at the bottom." This was obviously a big moment coming from the highest level of the federal government, understanding that what attempts have been made to leverage Indian policy in a meaningful way has failed. And he goes on to say, both as a matter of justice and as a matter of enlightened social policy, we must begin to act on the basis of what the Indians themselves have long been telling us. The time has come to break decisively with the past and to create the conditions for a new era in which the Indian future is determined by Indian acts and Indian decisions. I mean, I just, even kind of reading that out loud, I read this quote 1,000 times, I get goosebumps. You know, goosebumps that are, you know, originated in hope and originated in, you know, some of the burdens and the barriers that have been put in place for Indian people for 200-300 years are now being are now starting to be removed, and our trustee, the federal government, is beginning to understand that for Indian country to thrive and prosper, the decisions and the control has to be a sovereign choice by tribes to be able to control their destinies. So this is maybe the most important quote, honestly, as it relates to sort of modern economic development and modern economic choice in Indian country. And it's just important to recognize and to understand how pivotal this was for our communities. What came of that quote, just a short few years later, 4 or 5 years later, was one of the most important pieces of legislation that has impacted tribes in the last 50 years, and that is the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act. So this act allowed for tribes to make their own decisions, allowed for tribes to administer many of the programs that had been administered for decades, if not a couple hundred years, depending on the tribe, that had been administered by first the War Department and then the Interior Department. So some of those services that were first taken over by tribes and designed by tribes were IHS programs, some road and transportation programs, some forestry programs, elements of certainly education. This act really allowed for the tribal college movement to expand. And when I think of tribal colleges, tribal colleges are designed strategically and thoughtfully to be able to provide education in our way on the topics that we see as being most important to our community, and to build this type of skills that we want our community members to have to be able to contribute to tribal economies and to be able to provide in meaningful ways for their families. So this act was important not only for self-administration of big programs, but it born from it this rapid expansion of tribal colleges, which is producing an outsized number of the educational credentials over the past 40 years in Indian country. So really, this act was the first opportunity for tribes to be empowered to reassume responsibility for their communities. And reassume is important. That goes back to that original slide where I paused and looked at our historic tribal economies, where we did thrive as a people, and our economies were rich and complicated, and we had what we needed. This act allowed us to reassume, certainly under different circumstances, our ability to provide choice to grow in the ways that we wanted to grow. Another critical piece of sort of self-determination, economic self-determination policy came in the late 1980s. After particularly a lot of tribes, a handful of tribes, I should say, in New England, in the 70s, they really began to use bingo as a means to generate revenues, and use bingo as a way to bring community together. And these bingo operations began to really, really grow. And as gaming in the United States began to grow in the 60s and 70s, a lot of tribal leaders said, hey, we have the exclusive right to have our own, going back to IRA, to have our own corporations that we own as tribes. We want to get into gaming like we are doing in bingo, but take it sort of to the next level. So it's affirmed that we truly have the ability to participate in this industry. And one of the key motivators, you can imagine how difficult it was to get Indian Gaming Regulatory Act through Congress. But one of the things that, anecdotally, what I hear in stories of tribal leaders from the time was that the early success of self-determination policies, with tribes taking over a lot of these responsibilities, began to reap considerable benefits on things like poverty reduction, on household income, on housing or home ownership in our tribal communities. And that argument was certainly attractive to those that were really engaging on trying to make gaming a legal commercial activity for tribes. And in 1988, Congress passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, which allowed tribes to run their own gaming operations, not in the areas in which they had associated trust land. So gaming operations through IGRA can't be in non-attached, non-trust land, off-reservation, on off-reservation land. It was really focused on these gaming operations in communities that would have benefits, would benefit employment opportunities, would help establish a market where revenue could cycle and support a more robust tribal economy. I would say gaming probably, as you all are aware, it's not so much the case here in Montana, but across Indian country, gaming has had an outsized impact on tribes' ability to raise revenues. And raising revenues certainly is important, but why do tribes have these gaming operations? It's not just to make revenue, it's to make revenue that is then allocated or shared, a portion of it, to tribal governments to provide the goods and services that we need, right, as Indian people and as tribal communities. So this Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was, again, another one of those momentous moments in tribes' ability to really exert their economic sovereignty. And I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of self-determination era and the Self-Determination Act and tribes beginning to take over contracts and compacting some of these federal programs that they were never able to manage themselves. And now through self-determination, they're able to. And what in the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, what kind of impact or the consequences of our ability to formally practice economic self-determination in ways that we hadn't for a couple hundred years. And I think it's pretty clear when you look at some of the data associated with this. And we're in the process of updating data using the 2020 census data. So we'll be updating these charts in the next few months. But look at per capita income for tribes outside of Navajo, between 1990 and 2010. That's it. While the total number, the total per capita amount is small, the growth is substantial. So $8,200 in 1990 to 12,000, north of 12,000, where you see 1990 for the rest of the United States only went up. It went up less than a couple $1,000s. So we are outpacing due in many respects due to our ability to fulfill our own economic destinies through self-determination. Other consequences, other data that showcases that this that our ability to take over economic decisions have been fruitful, and some of these figures are just startling, in my opinion. So look at per capita income for Indians outside of Navajo. we grew 46% over those 2 decades from 1990 to 2010. The rest of the United States grew 7.8%. Household income grew by 27%. United States and real median income went down 2%. Child poverty went down. Family poverty went down by 12%. Our overcrowded homes went down by 4%. Some of these figures are just mind-boggling when you think about how quickly tribes were able to exert their sovereignty and for economic measures, and how productive how big of an impact that has had on our tribal families. The other consequence of economic self-determination is the proliferation of tribally owned enterprises. So I would consider gaming operations, tribal gaming operations, as tribal enterprises. And we certainly saw an expansion of gaming operations across the country. But I will note, before I get into these others, I will note that gaming, it's a myth, a misconception nationally that tribes are all wealthy because they have gaming operations. There's about 250 tribes that have gaming operations. And when you look at the data more closely, there's really only 30 or 40 tribes that have gaming operations that produce considerable revenues and considerable value to tribal communities. So it's not a tool necessarily that is equitably accessible to tribes, knowing that gaming is certainly a market-based enterprise where having access to people is critically important for those to work well. I didn't provide this piece of regulation as one of the more critical elements of federal Indian policy associated with self-determination, but in the 1980s, the SBA, Small Business Administration, allowed for disadvantaged businesses to be able to have an advantage in accessing contracts with the federal government. And tribes in the 1980s began to start these non-gaming tribal enterprises that do federal contracting with various agencies of the federal government. And you can just see like the power of capacity building in this chart particularly within tribal governments, but within tribal practitioners, that we began to test our hand at doing federal contracts in the 1980s. And that picked up in the 1990s. And as the economy slowed down, federal contracting generally slowed down. But you get to the 2000s, where the economy really started to boom. We had 20, 30 years of experience as tribal governments managing very complex programs. And you see, in this case, you see federal contracting enterprises just blow up. And you can see in the chart here that these are the number of new tribal enterprises that are non-gaming, which is mostly federal contracting. You can see how many new enterprises came on board on an annual basis. 2020, there was 100 new tribally owned federal contracting enterprises. And these enterprises play such a big role. Let me use my community, for example. The Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes have several tribal enterprises in several federal contracting businesses. And I think our sort of principal federal contracting enterprise is called S&K Technologies. And S&K Technologies, it's hard to keep up with them, but I think they employ over 1,500 employees. They're providing millions of dollars annually in direct allocations to our tribal government, of which our tribal government is using that for a wide variety of things, including our language perpetuation efforts, educational scholarships, to support our forestry programs, to help us buy back some of the land that we lost in the Burke Act or in allotment. I mean, how else can you define economic sovereignty if not by seeing both the rise of tribes' practice of controlling their destinies in this chart, and by just my one anecdote from my community of how powerful just one business has been in terms of improving the lives of not only Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribal members, but the broader Flathead community. So I've kind of shaped a little bit of these key pieces of policies and regulations that allowed us traction to support sovereign choice, economic sovereignty. But there's so much more that we need to do in terms of having robust economies and taking self-determination to the next level. This is a chart. I think the data goes up to 2010. Again, this is one that we're beginning to update with the 2020 census data. But you can see the consequence, or the implications, I should say, of how we've grown our modern tribal economies by looking at where Native people are working in the industries in which they're working, or the occupations that they have. And it's pretty clear, like where we've invested in our tribal economies. It's, looking at community and social services. So anything on the right side of zero means we're overrepresented compared to regional job market, and everything on the left of the zero is where we're underrepresented. So overrepresented community and social services, that's a byproduct of our expanding tribal governments as we've taken over these BIA compacts and contracts, similar to protective services, the growth of our law enforcement directly associated with 638 compacting, our healthcare. We've taken over, many tribes have taken over our health clinics and have expanded employment opportunities for our communities in that space. Fishing, farming, building, construction, transportation, these are all sort of aligned with, again, tribal governments, the kind of the tip of the spear of a building capacity in our tribal communities. And of course, as as an employee, you develop these skill sets working for tribal governments, you can translate those into private sector operations. But there are definitely areas where we are underrepresented. And I really think about, the experience in Indian country in the pandemic, the economic experience in the pandemic. And we did a lot of research in this space that informed considerable amounts of policy over the past couple of years. But because American Indian and Alaska Natives are so concentrated in certain industries, particularly the services industry, we felt the economic shock of the shutdown in the pandemic more dramatically than any other population in the United States, because we had so many of our Native workers that were associated with these businesses and an industry that shut down completely. And that had drastic impacts on Indian country. And so as we think about, and as both tribes and Native entrepreneurs think about where to grow, there's certainly a lot of opportunity for diversifying our tribal economies, so we're not so dependent on certain elements of revenue generation, gaming or federal contracting, or some of the compacted resources that we manage in partnership with the federal government. So incredible amount of change, positive change that has happened economically because of economic self-determination. But we are nowhere close yet to reach our full economic potential. I go back to President Nixon's his quote where he delineated nearly on every measure Indian people are at the bottom of the ranks. And while we have seen the fastest growth of our population, the fastest growth of household income, the fastest reduction of poverty, we are still close to the bottom. And so we have a lot of opportunity to continue to practice sovereign choice over our economic affairs. I've got maybe 10 more minutes before I want to open it up, and I wanted to underscore one element that is often not thought about when you think of economic sovereignty, and that is the role of legal infrastructure in growing our robust and diversified tribal economies. Over the past primarily 20 years or so, if not longer, but for many tribes, 20 years, particularly in Montana, tribes have expanded their legal infrastructure. That is the development of the laws and the codes that may drive economic opportunity, that may safeguard safeguard capital and credit that moves into our communities directly to tribal governments or to native entrepreneurs. We've developed these secured transaction laws that remove some of the barriers for banks doing work in Indian country, and we've created these lien filing systems so investors know what debts exist, but we've done it on our own terms. We've created our own legal infrastructure that's becoming better understood by non-Indian governments, and this has created sort of the infrastructure, the baseline that is needed legally to be able to participate in these complex modern economies. Tribes have initiated incorporation laws where you don't have to go to the state, in this case, the state of Montana, to incorporate your business. You can go and get incorporated under your own tribe's tribal incorporation laws for nonprofits, for LLCs, for a wide variety of different incorporation models. And we've greatly expanded our tribal court's capacity to manage some of these economic cases that come in front of our communities. And this is important because we need capital to be able to grow and expand our economies in relevant ways. And our legal infrastructure is adapting to ways to play the game, while at the same time making sure that we're have sovereign decisions over our own laws that impact our communities and our people. The last thing I wanted to do is just share maybe a little bit about the, and maybe I could have done this at the beginning, but a little bit more about the organization that I lead, which is called the Center for Indian Country Development. And this is also, I see it as a byproduct of the economic self-determination movement, where non-Indian institutions are becoming more and more positive partners in helping to allow tribes support tribes' ability to for long-term economic prosperity. And we are a national research and policy institute. We are committed to advancing economic self-determination through research and data that will inform public policy. So I think you all know, if you've engaged in Indian country, we're good storytellers. Our tribal leaders are powerful orators. and have been pretty effective in seeking policy change. But public policy nowadays really in many cases requires data and evidence-based decision-making. And the Center for Indian Country Development is kind of the national think tank that is pairing the experiences from our tribes and tribal leaders and tribal organizations with the data to back up the shifts and changes to economic barriers and the ability to use policy as a tool to tap into economic opportunities. And as an example, we do a lot of different research on tribal taxation and federal financing and funding programs, on research that informs policy around economic infrastructure, to access to capital for entrepreneurs and tribes. If you have the opportunity, you should go to our website, which is at the minneapolisfed.org/Indian Country. There's tons of resources that you can use in your classes, that you can share with your family, share with your friends, your community, that we've produced over the last several years. But just as an example, we've done research in partnership with Native Community Development Financial Institutions, the CDFIs, which provide culturally responsive, culturally appropriate financial services to tribal communities. There's quite a few Native CDFIs in the state of Montana, and about 70 or so around the country. And we do research to identify, so how are they having positive impacts or any impacts on Native people and Native entrepreneurs through their services, when a lot of banks don't come to the table to work in Indian Country. These are intermediary entities that provide the capital and the financial services that we really need to grow our economies. So we've done research on how they've improved credit outcomes, where they're located, what their assets are, and how they engage on development services, to how they're informing, sort of addressing the wealth gaps that exist in Indian Country, and the role that new Native CDFIs play in communities that don't have banking institutions. Similarly, we've done work, again, just in the space of Native CDFIs, where we leverage the power of the Federal Reserve, the convening power of the Federal Reserve, to bring people together, to share best practices, to share research and data, and to inform policy. So we create the meeting space, and recently we've done that by bringing banks all across the country, CDFIs, community banks together to talk about finance in Indian Country. We've informed a critical piece of legislation called the Community Reinvestment Act. We do this all in partnership with tribal leaders. You can see in the middle of the screen, we have tribal leaders from all across Indian Country that advise me and advise my colleagues at the center. And we listen directly in communities of the economic experiences they're having, in this case, the effect of inflation in our tribal communities, so that we can support the stability of tribal economies in policy making. Lastly, and I think this is will be some, for those of you who do work around, business, or have any chapters on tribal economies, we've produced a number of different data tools that you'll find really interesting, that maybe some of your students might want to use. We've produced this finance atlas, where you can understand how these federal programs are penetrating or not our tribal areas. We developed a Native American labor market dashboard that on a monthly basis identifies unemployment rates and labor participation rates and some other labor market indicators, with maps of Native American financial institutions that might be beneficial for understanding where financial services could be, you can access financial services, and then individual reservation profiles to understand some of the demographic and data associated with some of the reservations across the country. So I'm gonna pause my formal remarks by sort of bridging back to my very first slide of our tribal economies were so robust pre-contact. And while like any, most stories in Indian country, there have been difficult eras, and tribes have fought hard, and tribal leaders have fought hard and have been resilient on the onslaught of policies that haven't worked on our behalf. And we've made it to this era where we can truly now practice our own self-determination over our economies. And we see the sky's the limit, and Indian country reaching its full economic potential, and reaching its full economic potential on their own terms. And if there's not a good definition of economic sovereignty, that would be a beautiful way to define it. So with that, Jennifer, I will stop and love to entertain any questions or comments from today's attendees.
I have so many questions. First of all, thank you so much. I am just delighted that you have presented on this topic, because it is something that a lot of our business teachers often are, and economics teachers say, well, how do we integrate Indian Ed for All? And I think you really hit on very clearly that, kind of understanding the economic situation and understanding, the sovereignty, and then understanding the economics and the sovereignty together really kind of paints a whole picture. First of all, I was wondering, would you be willing to share your slideshow with us by any chance, especially that first slide with the currencies? I found that just fascinating, and I feel like that's information that elementary teachers could use all the way up through, we actually have a couple college professors here tonight, so hopefully that could be really useful to them as well. So that would be awesome. But one of the main things that I wanted to ask about was the banking deserts, on reservations. So on your particular reservation, I've driven through it. I know where some of the banks are, but if I drive from Fort Belknap to Fort Peck, where am I going to get cash? If I'm going to try to buy a house, where do I get a loan? How do I get a car loan? So I'm just wondering, what are some of the barriers to individual economic independence when it comes to not just rural, but reservation rural?
Yeah, that's a good question. Associated, I guess the basis of the question is, how do you access capital? How do you access financial services in the middle of a banking desert? And certainly I could go into the data where banking deserts exist, and certainly we're overrepresented in banking deserts across the country, we being Indian country, our tribal areas. This is an ongoing issue, and this is why you see the growth of Native community development financial institutions. I mean, there was like 2 or 3 in the 1990s. There's 70 right now, and it's these Native CDFIs provide loans. They provide financial services. Some of them are credit unions. Some of them are banks. And this is really an act, right, of tribes and tribal communities saying, no, we can't access. We're in a banking desert. We can't get the financial services that we need. You know what? We're going to do it ourselves. And the movement is continuing to grow. In fact, I was in DC last week, and there was a Native CDFI summit that included all the Native CDFIs around the country. And I can tell you the energy was palpable. The growth strategies are real, and they're really helping to fulfill these significant gaps that we have to access financial services, to grow businesses, to start businesses, to get a mortgage. But I won't say it's all peachy keen. This continues to be one of the biggest chronic issues that we have in shoring up tribal economies, and that is accessing affordable credit. And it will continue to be an issue that we work on at the Center for Indian Country Development, but that tribes work on directly. My tribe's one of those, right? So we've got our own bank. We did that. We had that same realization is like, there are banking institutions in our on Flathead, but we wanted to have our own, and we wanted to run that as an enterprise, and we want to provide those low-cost services to our tribal people, and we did it, right? So I think you're going to see more and more of that, particularly as our economies grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I think it's so important, especially for teachers who are talking about, economic disparities. This is just a really clear disparity that exists right here in Montana. And so it's so important. But on that note, would there be a place for incubators in the high school setting or at the tribal college setting? Is that something that you might be able to provide us with some resources for if teachers are interested in looking at an incubator model?
Yeah, certainly. There's I could provide some resources maybe after the event tonight. Business incubators are growing. In fact, there is a piece of policy right now that is specific to Indian country. So tribal incubator act. I can't remember the formal title, but certainly this is essentially the creation of a meeting space to be able to grow entrepreneurs in an efficient way in our tribal communities, and incubators are a really good resource. I think of Northern Cheyenne. They through a tribal enterprise owned by Northern Cheyenne, they developed essentially an incubator, a business center that not only creates an opportunity for a marketplace, but it also creates the opportunity to learn amongst entrepreneurs. And it's had a variety of different successes since it was built probably 5 or 6 years ago. So this is a model that's definitely working across Indian country.
Cool. I think that could be really exciting. And then one more on the notes that I was taking, and then we've got a few from our participants this evening. So please make sure, folks, that you put your questions in chat. If it was a while ago, don't worry. I did cut and paste it so I can find it tonight. When we look at the over and underrepresentation chart, what kind of factor do you think that education is in that to get, something like, education moved over to the right and, some of those other services? What part does education play in that?
Oh, it plays such a big role, or just a massive role, particularly high quality education and K-12 and, sort of preparation for some of the technical skills that you can get through dual credit, right? Or dual enrollment. But the educational opportunities that are available in the Montana university system that are specific to the tribal colleges. I mean, education is sort of the bread and butter of our economies. I don't think anyone can argue with that because it creates the skill set and the business skills to be able to thrive in community. I will go back for a minute to my home community, Confederate Salish and Kootenai tribes. We did a very expansive survey in 2017 of tribal members, and I think we got like 3,500 tribal members that did this survey that identified their skill set, their interests, their motivations for their careers, and CSKT analyzed that data, and then they built programs at some of the local high schools, and then they built specific credential programs at Salish Kootenai College to sort of meet where the skill sets were and where the opportunities were in our local economy. So, I mean, education is such an important partner in long-term economic prosperity of our people.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, it's exciting. Some of the programming that's happened between SKC and the tribal high schools has been awesome. Somebody is asking, what is an incubator program?
So I think the incubator program is it's a sort of a model where individuals with entrepreneurial ideas can have a space not only a physical space, but a communal space to be able to share some of the ideas that they have to start a business, to incubate a business, right? Or to expand an existing business. I mean, I think of it as like, well, think about it, you know, the holidays are coming up, or you have an idea, good or bad, right? And you're sitting around the table with all your family, with all your relatives, and you bring up the idea, and you get crowd perspective, crowdsourced perspectives on your ideas. Incubators is similar in nature, where you have like-minded folks who are interested in the business space, who want to sort of take that idea to the next level. There's opportunities to access through incubators certain grant funds, depending on the incubator programs that exist. But I always see it as like, this is a space to be in partnership with people that want to help you grow your business idea.
Thank you. One person asked, can you explain how they define wealth in making the statement that bison-reliant societies were among the richest in the world?
I can get back to you on that. I would have to go to the economic historians that did that specific work. But you know what, Jennifer, I will make sure after the event that I share that piece of research that they did with you, and then you could share it with the group. If I remember correctly, it's in the abstract of the research of how they define wealth.
Awesome. Okay, I'll add those in any the book and the links I've already added to the resource list. Do you know of any funding resources that are specifically available to Native Americans to start their own businesses, and where would they go to find that funding?
Totally. I'm just thinking in the context of Montana. Montana has the Department of Commerce. It has a program called the Indian Equity Fund program. And the Indian Equity Fund program provides grants to budding entrepreneurs who are starting their own businesses or want to take their business to the next level. And I haven't looked at the program in a little bit, but it was $7,000 to $14,000. And you really designed to use those resources to build additional collateral within the business, so that you can access a loan and you can use that collateral to service the loan, to get the loan. So there definitely, I don't know exactly where that program is today, but there was roughly $250,000. The other thing I will mention for those interested in funding for business operations, I had this unique experience last year where I went on detail to the United States Department of the Treasury, and I was responsible for $20 billion from the American Rescue Plan for tribal governments. And anecdotally, after we allocated all the resources, anecdotally, I know that individual tribes were building these business grant programs and funding them with significant resources. So my recommendation would go to a tribal government where you're located, and ask them what kind of resources they may have available for business grants.
Great, awesome. One other clarification, just because I'm not sure, you said it really, really quickly, and I'm not sure people caught it, and it has kind of peeped in before, but could you talk to us just a tiny bit about what is AIM?
American Indian Movement. It's interesting. I don't know how best to describe AIM. I think AIM was a group of tribal leaders that demanded change, primarily in the 1960s and the 1970s, and AIM still exists now with different chapters around the country. But I think AIM sort of opened America's conscious about the conditions and some of the poor policies that have impacted tribes for a very, very long time. So AIM was very critical in sort of bringing some of our challenges and our opportunities to the mainstream.
think about Vine Deloria Jr. and the Lone Ranger and Tonto fist fight in heaven. That's a great, expanding of that. Well, Casey, I can't thank you so much. This was just wonderful, and once again expanded my whole concept of sovereignty and push the boundaries on what my minuscule understanding was before we began this webinar series. And I just thank you so much. Also, I do want to tell everyone that registration for the Best Practices Conference, the 16th Annual Indian Education for All Best Practices Conference, is up, and we put the link in the chat. I also put the link in the resources guide, and please make sure to pre-register for the pre-conference sovereignty curriculum development workshop. One of our presenters, Leah Whitford, will be co-presenting that workshop with Mike Jetty, and you will be able to leave with usable sovereignty materials for your classroom. So we are really excited about that, but we have lots of other great things happening as well. Are you doing something amazing in your classroom? Please make sure that you do a call for proposal, because we are wanting to hear from teachers this year. So make sure to look for those things. And then on this coming Thursday is our last and final sovereignty session. And I'm just so sad about it because it's been so incredible. And so many of you have been joining us consistently. It's been very exciting, but that will be with Donnie Wetzel. And he's really going to be talking about sovereignty in action with our Native youth that he's been working with, and some of the other amazing work that he's been doing in the tribal resilience and relations unit. So, and I probably got that wrong. It's the true unit. So, acronyms. But anyhow, we're really looking forward to that on Thursday night. So please make sure that you join us for that last one. And then thank you so much for your comments. We are looking at them, and I think that we definitely could do another focused, maybe mini sovereignty series on certainly ICWA. That has been a topic that has come up a lot, and it is a very specialty topic. And so I think it could deserve its own webinar, especially with the timeliness of it and seeing what will happen with the Supreme Court and the implications for tribal communities and the impacts on tribal sovereignty. But in addition, also the implications on non-Indian children and the adoption system. So I think that's a really timely topic. So everyone, I just want to say thank you so much. Casey, thank you so much. And I hope to see you all on Thursday. Stay safe and definitely stay warm. And we will see you in a few days. Thanks, everybody.